listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Frederick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Proof Text. I am Michael Halcomb, and this is a Fallacy of the Week episode. And as always, we've got an interesting one for you. Now, this one has been floating around social media, particularly Facebook. I've seen numerous people sharing it and commenting on it. So I thought it'd be a good one to look at. So this is from Robin R. Myers, the book Saving God from Religion, A Minister's Search for Faith in a Skeptical Age. And if you're watching, I'm going to pull the quote here and put it up on the screen. And if you're listening, I'll read it out loud. So here it is. It says, here's the quote from that book. Consider this remarkable fact. In the Sermon on the Mount, there's not a single word about what to believe, only words about what to do and how to be. By the time the Nicene Creed is written, only 3 centuries later, there's not a single word in it about what to do and how to be, only words about what to believe. All right, so this one's kind of annoying. There are actually a lot of fallacies. I'm just going to name a handful of them here, but the most obvious one right off the jump is the false dichotomy fallacy. And what the quote overall is doing is it's setting up a dichotomy between belief and action, right? As if they are somehow mutually exclusive. And the New Testament itself makes it clear that faith without works is dead. So it pairs faith or belief, allegiance, and action. And this quote then is running sort of antithetical to that. So it's ignoring even the possibility that religious doctrine can somehow encompass both faith and works at the same time or simultaneously. So the quote is aiming to contrast the practical instructions in the Sermon on the Mount with the doctrinal focus of the Nicene Creed a century later. And what it's doing is it's offering up this implication of a shift from a focus in the New Testament on deeds to centuries later abandoning deeds and just simply going to mere beliefs. And so it's making the point that there's this negative Christian development. Development probably isn't even the word. They're kind of painting it as rather than an evolution, a devolution. And so this false dichotomy fallacy is the first one that we see here. Anybody can notice that right off the jump, right? Another thing that I'd like to point out here is that perhaps we could call this a historical fallacy because the two things, the Sermon on the Mount and the Nicene Creed, were created in completely different historical contexts, with different historical figures addressing different historical needs and issues. And so the Sermon on the Mount, right, first century document, dealing with people's actions, and of course their beliefs motivate their actions. So that's a different context out in near Capernaum, right, rural Capernaum, than the Nicene Creed, which is attempting to combat doctrinal heresies and among other things, and to create a sort of unifying set of beliefs, right? And those beliefs, obviously, are meant to shape how one lives. So again, we see the false dichotomy fallacy sort of even bleeding its way into this historical fallacy a little bit. And we could also maybe point out that there's, an oversimplification fallacy here, because what the quote is doing, what the author is doing, is simplifying, ultimately, the contents of both Jesus' Sermon on the Mount and the contents of the Nicene Creed, and reducing them to one aspect each of their broader messages. The Sermon on the Mount is be or do. The creed is believe. And it's just reducing them to those things. And this is problematic. It's a gross oversimplification of the sermon versus the creed. And those two things actually are both of them are very much complex, especially when we start looking at the Greek of each of them. Any scholar who's tried to translate the Greek of the Sermon on the Mount, for example, knows that even the Beatitudes, that word blessed, boy, that's a challenge. How are we actually supposed to translate that? And then you get into the creed, and you have some tricky words there as well. And so we don't want to devolve into an oversimplification like this. That's very problematic. We could also maybe point out and it's related to that, the point I just made, but maybe what's called often the selective attention fallacy, which a lot of people just call cherry picking. And so the quote itself, what it's doing, right, as it boils things down, it's actually just highlighting certain aspects of the Sermon on the Mount, highlighting a certain aspect of the Nicene Creed, and ignoring all the other things so that it can boil them down. Maybe I should have said this one first, the cherry picking fallacy, because that's ultimately like the end result of that is the oversimplification fallacy. Another thing, I want to point out the way that this is framed, because this is actually, to me, really important. The way words are very critical, but the way someone frames things and the words that they use to frame something, we got to pay attention to that. And there's this one fallacy, maybe not really well known, but it's called something like the misleading vividness fallacy. And you see this here where the author uses the phrase, the remarkable fact. And so what the author's doing here in using such words is, I think, is attempting to make a stronger impression on the person reading this than is merited. And they're suggesting this dramatic shift. It's remarkable, without actually ever stating how it's remarkable or a full explanation of remarkable. Now they'll go on to oversimplify it and cherry pick, but there's no real explanation of what's actually remarkable. That's kind of a very vivid term, and I think it's misleading for that reason. So we have this vividness fallacy or misleading vividness fallacy. It's sort of a rhetorical fallacy, right? I think too, looking at this, we might talk about an anachronistic fallacy. The author does seem to be applying a set of modern, maybe social justice standards versus a set of modern doctrinal standards, right, to these historical events or documents, and freighting them with that. So, for example, let me explain how anachronism is at work here. Anachronism is taking something from modern history and reading it back onto something older, something ancient in this case. So if you've come all the way through church history and you're familiar with the law versus grace debates, that kind of thing, then perhaps, right, that you're reading through things through that lens, that dichotomy, and you're forcing that dichotomy back onto this. And maybe that's ultimately what leads to the false dichotomy. So that leads you then to actually ignore the historical context in which the sermon was created, in which the creed was created. So this is really important, because when you're reading your modern historical standards and practices and ideas back onto the text, you're ultimately going to engage in you're engaging in anachronism, and you're going to force the text to either say or do things you want them to say, or force false comparisons, as in this case, or false contrasts. So I guess I'll do one more here. The straw man fallacy. That's a very common fallacy. And the way that I think this could be present here is that it's misrepresenting the purpose of the Nicene Creed by suggesting that it has nothing to do with moral behavior or actions, whereas, wait for it, its very purpose, was to define orthodoxy in the face of differing and faltering and heretical beliefs at the time, so that people could engage in orthopraxy, right living. And so the author is kind of like creating this false dilemma. You've heard me say this on the podcast before if you listen to these episodes, right? Straw man fallacies. You create this problem and you prop it up, and then you come along and you blow it over, you knock it over and make yourself look like the wise one or the victor, when actually that's not really been a problem for anyone, and it's not a problem. So that's what the author's doing here, in a way, is creating this problem that doesn't really exist, and then knocking it over to show their intellectual superiority with some good turns of phrase, perhaps. But yeah, these are fallacies that we see that are inferred from the content and implications of quote, rather than an analysis of the actual text themselves. That doesn't happen at all here. An acknowledgement of the historical parameters in which each thing, the sermon and the creed, were created, and it's failing to have or contain a balance on the issues of teaching and belief and action and being and these sorts of things, which are all in the Christian life wound up in one another. So yeah, there's quite a few fallacies here, and we need to be aware of these kinds of things. This sort of meme floats around and boom, 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 gets reshared, gets liked, gets loved, and we need to stop and think about these sorts of things rather than maybe pitting them against one another. The better thing would be to talk about each thing in its own historical context and value it for its own historical merit. And then maybe instead of pitting them against one another, hey, let's bring them in conversation with one another and see what emerges from that. And what you'll see when you do that is precisely what happens in the rest of the New Testament, is that faith isn't pitted against works. They go hand in hand. So, pay attention to your fallacies, pay attention to these sorts of things. And I'll stop here and say I hope that helps.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.